Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again. After talking last week about existing Lovecraft anthologies, about the conundrum of not really being able to find a Lovecraft anthology, an anthology of the best and most significant and most relevant short stories written by what is effectively my favorite writer, after the frustration of not being really satisfied with any of the anthologies out there, I just had to come up with the ideal dream anthology of H.P. Lovecraft's short stories. The challenge I'd given myself was to keep the anthology under 80,000 words. 80,000 words is a standard measure for a slim book. It's the word count most publishers are comfortable with when it comes to publishing new authors, because if the new author is a flop, if the book doesn't sell, publishing an 80,000 word book doesn't cost too much in terms of printing costs and shipping costs, at least not as much as publishing a 600-page book or something like that. I completely failed. It was impossible, it was too difficult, so I set myself a new challenge of keeping this Lovecraft anthology under 100,000 words. Because again, as I mentioned, the idea is to collect the most significant stories of H.P. Lovecraft, and what I wanted to produce was an anthology that would be a good introduction to somebody who was discovering Lovecraft for the first time, but it would also be an anthology you would be happy to carry with you on a holiday somewhere if at one point you feel like rereading Lovecraft and you don't want to bring with you your Barnes & Noble's complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, or your new annotated H.P. Lovecraft, which is roughly this big. It is actually this big. This, by the way, is the second new annotated H.P. Lovecraft, the second volume by Leslie Klinger. Expect a review of these and the first volume sometime early next year. Moving on. This idea of keeping the collection under 100,000 words is completely arbitrary, of course, and as I ask you guys to tell me in the comment section about your dream anthologies, what short stories or novels you would put in your ideal H.P. Lovecraft collection, don't feel compelled to respect the same criteria. Also because 100,000 words is not a very long book at all, especially if you don't print it in a huge font. It's probably something like a 320 page book, which is not long at all. It was just a challenge I'd set myself. The other controversial thing I did, and this makes me very uncomfortable, so please know I'm the first person to be upset by this, I didn't put these stories in chronological order of writing or of publication. I just went completely crazy. The reason why I did this is that I kept in mind that idea that this would be a good introduction to H.P. Lovecraft for someone who had never read him before, and I wanted it to be a varied experience showcasing the differences and the diversity in Lovecraft's writing. Lovecraft wasn't really a jack of all trades. He kind of focused on a specific genre most of his life, but he did write in a few varieties of it. He had several different modes of writing. He played and toyed with different styles, different forms, and say this anthology doesn't even showcase all that he wrote. Say I didn't put any of his comic stories in it, even though he wrote a couple of pretty funny ones. Let's cut to the chase. The table of contents of my, once more, completely fictional and imaginary dream anthology of H.P. Lovecraft is in the description box below. I'll go through it in the course of the video. I would open it with Dagon. I would open the collection with Dagon. In my experience, possibly just because of this incredible impact it had on my reading career and on my life as a reader, I can't imagine reading Lovecraft, approaching Lovecraft for the first time with anything different. The way the story condenses within the span of, 3-4 pages, kind of everything that Lovecraft had to say in a beautiful, effective, fast and interesting and thrilling manner. The way you get the thrill when the monster appears, and it looks like that's the climax of the story, but the climax actually arrives later with the narrator's reflection on the horror of creation and of the cosmos, where humanity and humans are just puny and meaningless, and all of our wars and all of our enterprises and the things we invest so much import in are kind of ridiculous in the eye of the cosmos. That was pretty shocking for the young bookchemist, and I can imagine it will be equally shocking to many readers who approach Lovecraft for the first time. Right after Dagon, I put the Call of Cthulhu. What I wanted to get here was the effect you get with some heavy metal, thrash metal records. My inspiration was the great Metallica records, where the title track comes second. The great piece you came here to witness arrives straight away. I'm not married to the idea of getting Call of Cthulhu second in the collection. It is, in my opinion, possibly... yeah, I would say it's Lovecraft's strongest short story. It is definitely his most famous. Cthulhu is now a staple of popular culture. I do believe that Dagon and Call of... well, we could say that Dagon is kind of a first idea, even a first draft of Call of Cthulhu, both for its themes and for the plot itself, so it might feel a bit repetitive and it might give the reader the idea that Lovecraft only writes about sea monsters, which would be... not entirely correct/incorrect, but yeah, I wanted to give the main course right away to the reader. The third story in my collection would be the music of Erich Zann, a personal favorite of Lovecraft for a long time and a personal favorite of many critics. It is definitely Lovecraft's subtlest short story, the one where the horror doesn't take the form of slime or jelly or tentacles. Not that the horror necessarily does that too often in Lovecraft short stories. I feel like people give him too much crap for that, but still, this is an especially subdued story. It's definitely Lovecraft's most Borgesian slash Cortazarian short story, the kind of story where you can feel his influence on metafictional writing, certain branches of postmodernism, most strongly. It is eerie, sinister, fascinating, mysterious. It leaves you with more questions than you started with, but in a very good way, if you ask me. I do not feel like the openness of Erich Zann takes away from it. I probably liked it less when I was a teenager because I was looking for more closure, but I do think it's one of his strongest pieces. And I would follow Erich Zann with The Doom That Came to Sarnath and The Dunwich Horror. The Doom That Came to Sarnath is a personal favorite of mine. I do believe that it is the story where Lovecraft cranks up his archaisms and the heftiness of his language to the max to convey the story of this doomed ancient civilization. It's an excellent example of his fantastical, even straight-up fantasy writing, and in Sarnath you can see how he was able to marry his themes and the genres he wrote in with a specific language. There is this idea that Lovecraft, even in his personal life, spoke as an 18th century gentleman. He was fond of archaisms and old ways of saying. But at the same time, one thing you find in his biographies is this idea that in the way he spoke, in his archaisms, in his obtruse, ancient lexicon, he wasn't really posing like an 18th century gentleman. The point is that he grew up reading books from the 1700s, and that's where his education came from, where his, those books shaped his personality. If anything, he would have been a hypocrite acting like a man of his time. By all means, he was an 18th century gentleman, and he was able to exploit that the peculiarities and the quirks of his language and of the way he grew up to create the atmosphere of these fantastical ancient worlds he created. That's one of the many reasons why I find it ridiculous when people criticize Lovecraft because he wrote in ugly English. The parallel, once more, that I always use is that it's a bit like criticizing noise rock or black metal, these music genres, because they don't sound pretty. The point is that they're not supposed to sound pretty. And I wanted to put Sarnath, which is so outrageously over the top on a level of language, with doom in capital all over the place, right after Erich Zann, precisely because Erich Zann is such a subtle story and Sarnath really isn't, in the same way as the Dunwich Horror really isn't a subtle story. The Dunwich Horror is a peculiar one. It's not included in the Call of Cthulhu published by Penguin Classics, which, as you might remember if you've seen my previous video in this mini-series, is the anthology I would recommend, the anthology that you can actually buy in bookstores, that I would actually recommend new readers. Dunwich Horror is not included there, and S.D. Joshi is not a huge fan of that story. The reason why I personally believe that he dislikes it is that it's kind of an oddity in Lovecraft's stories, especially at this time, especially in the 1920s. The kind of scholar Joshi is, S.D. Joshi being of course the most prominent Lovecraftian scholar working today, is a scholar who focuses on poetics. Joshi follows the evolution of Lovecraft's philosophical and scientific thought throughout his career, and Joshi is not very fond of moments within Lovecraft's oeuvre where this unity of thought, the unity of Lovecraft poetics, is complicated or shows contradictions. Say, one of the reasons in I Am Providence, his monumental biography of Lovecraft, Joshi confesses that he is not sure how relevant the Lovecraft's fantastical stories are, because while in a way they are important to his evolution, they also take him away and also in a way delayed his writing of the science horror tales of his later career that Joshi considers to be Lovecraft's masterpieces. And I disagree with him on that front. I believe that Lovecraft's fantastical stories are among his best, and I did include quite a few in these anthologies. When it comes to Dunwich Horror, the reason why, again, I believe Joshi dislikes it is that it's kind of a contradiction once more in Lovecraft's oeuvre. The good guys eventually win, and they don't even win because of a random occurrence, because of luck, as it happens in Call of Cthulhu. They actually actively fight back evil and manage to destroy it. At one point, characters say, in the name of God, what can we do? And this association of the good guys with God is kind of puzzling in a story written by an admitted and advocate and vocal atheist such as Lovecraft. But these are kind of the reasons why I like Dunwich Horror. On a more literary critical level, I personally, as I've had many occasions to remark, like and adore literature's way to reflect the ambiguities and the endless contradictions of life and turn them into art. And I do believe that these incongruities in any author's poetics should not necessarily be dismissed, but should instead be embraced and studied and considered as the mark of, on the one hand, a broken world, and an inconsistent one, and a contradictory one, and of an evolving, stimulating intellect. But on a more simple level, the reason why I love the Dunwich Horror, which by the way I pronounced Dunwich because I once read that you're supposed to pronounce it a bit like Greenwich in London, but it might very well be Dunwich, as everyone else says. The reason why I like it, it's because it's thrilling. It's because it's very much a work of pulp fiction. For all that he wrote in mostly in weird tales and anyway in the pulps for most of his life, most Lovecraft stories do not really present that kind of payoff you really find in pulp fiction. There are exceptions. The ubiquitous fucking Herbert West Reanimator would be one, The Lurking Fear would be another. The Dunwich Horror is by far the best pulp story Lovecraft ever wrote. It does feature monsters running amok and characters coming together to defeat them and succeeding, and I like it precisely because of this state as an exception in Lovecraft's canon. The way I think about this is, Goosebumps books? If you're a 90s kid like me, you probably read a couple of those. I am kind of obsessed with the stuff, and most Goosebumps books featured a twist ending where it turns out that the characters were monsters all along or something of the sort. Most of these twist endings are kind of cruel and messed up, and either spell the main character's doom or reveals them to have been evil all along. But you do get the occasional Goosebumps book, Night in Terror Tower jumps to mind, where things simply turn out alright and nothing wrong really happens and the characters are just happy. And those exceptions make everything else stand out as more messed up and more unexpected. They introduce some variety in the series, the way Dunwich Horror, in my opinion, introduces some variety in the evolution of Lovecraft's plots. After Dunwich Horror, I would put Celephais, one of Lovecraft's most beautiful oniric dream stories, and a huge influence again on those postmodern, quirky, metafictional stories that blur distinctions between ontological layers and between our perception of existence and the act of it itself. Coming up next would be Color Out of Space and Quest of Iranon. Color Out of Space is a favorite among many fans. Lovecraft himself considered it for most of his life his strongest, most effective work of fiction, and it's evocative as little else I've read. It's beautiful, it's marvelous. Quest of Iranon, I like it even more. It might very well be Lovecraft's best fantasy tale, and as I mentioned in my previous video, it's the Lovecraft tale, in my opinion, his story that goes the closest to perfection but messes it up with that final sentence that was really unneeded and makes the story kind of soppy and sentimental, in my opinion, but still masterful, still a masterpiece. Coming up next would be the Cats of Ulthar, which is probably the most out of place story in an introduction to new readers. It is admittedly kind of a second tier fantastical short story in Lovecraft's canon, but I like it. I like cats, and I like the Cats of Ulthar, and most notably I find it hilarious to put the Cats of Ulthar right before the Rats in the Walls. The Rats in the Walls, the reason why I'm putting it here is because I think Quest of Iranon and Cats of Ulthar would lull readers into a bit of a state of tranquility where they expect, oh, these stories are not that scary after all, they're just a bit sinister and they're just a bit odd and evocative and fantastical, then and bam, they read The Rats in the Walls, which is by far the most messed up and the scariest story Lovecraft ever wrote. We're reaching the conclusion of the collection. The final 3 pieces would be the Silver Key, which I personally adore. A lot of it's left out of so many anthologies for whatever reason, but I feel like it's a bit of a manifesto for imaginative, fantastical enterprises, for the imagination, for nostalgia in the most elaborate and salvific sense of the word, for escapism, but not just mindless escapism, but escapism as a conscious pursuit in the face of a messed up world. And other than that, it's a manifesto of Lovecraft's poetics, and it gives you a key, if you pardon the pun, to interpret most of his other writing, and it's necessary, I believe, in any Lovecraft collection. And then Shadow over Innsmouth, whose influence on popular culture and on the evolution of horror is undeniable, and which contains in its final few pages some questioning of ontological dynamics, on the nature of experience, on the nature of knowledge, that walks a very thin line between modernism and postmodernism. I do believe that Shadow over Innsmouth's final paragraphs are ridiculously underestimated by criticism in general, and it also has a very powerful ending and quite unforgettable too. And I would close the collection with what is basically a bonus track, a special, a hidden song of sorts, which would be The Tomb, Lovecraft's earliest short story written as an adult in 1917. It's a personal favorite of mine. I believe it drips with the enthusiasm and passion of somebody finally finding their craft and finally realizing what they came into the world for, what their means of expression is, and writing as a confident, even overconfident writer. It's classic Gothic fiction. It's very Poe-esque in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe. For that reason, The Outsider could have served the same purpose, but I don't love The Outsider nearly as much as I love The Tomb's language and enthusiasm, and the way the story and the narrator are clearly so happy even just to be talking about these mysterious, sinister themes they are talking about. Speaking of The Outsider, honorable mentions or stories that I had to leave out for reasons of space, but oh my god, how could I do it? The one that jumps at me most of all would be The Whisperer in Darkness, the one among Lovecraft's major horror stories that I left out. I was tempted for a while to put The Whisperer in Darkness in and take out Shadow over Innsmouth, but I do believe that Shadow over Innsmouth overall is a better short story. It's more influential on, again, the evolution of popular culture and on future writing. And while Shadow over Innsmouth has a pretty slow and pretty weak middle part, if you ask me, Whisperer in Darkness, for all that its first half is masterful, it's among the best Lovecraft ever wrote, its second half stretches the suspension of disbelief in pretty silly ways and features the dumbest protagonist in a Lovecraft story. Basically the archetype of the unlikely character in horror movies who sees something sinister happening and goes, I have to investigate. Pickman's model and cool air are among Lovecraft's best, most effective, neatest horror, straight up horror stories, and both of these could have taken the place of the Rats in the Walls. Hypnos or The White Ship could have possibly taken the place of one or two of the more fantastical, dreamlike tales. As for the novels, I do not personally believe that any of Lovecraft's 3 novels deserves to be inserted in an anthology, the kind of work you present to new readers. At the Mountains of Madness is the go-to work of Lovecraftian fiction you read after you've read your first introduction into his world. And it's also, in a way, because that too is a masterpiece in its genre, it leaves you something to look forward to once you've finished the anthology. And finally, when it comes to The Haunter of the Dark and The Thing on the Doorstep, both these two are, again, very neat, very well-planned stories from Lovecraft's later career, and they are absolutely worthy of being included. It was just a matter of space that made me leave them out. If given more space, I would have included the following stories in order of priority: The Whisper in Darkness, Thing on the Doorstep, Curse of Yig, which is it's a collaboration technically, it's a personal favorite of mine, absolutely effective in how it portrays the protagonist's deterioration into madness in the span of a single night, very believable too, twist ending, very shocking, I love it. Pickman's Model, White Ship, Cool Air, and Hypnos. And if we are really going massive and turning this into a pretty big volume, say if these were my Library of America edition of Lovecraft, if they'd given me the chance instead of Peter Straub, other than these 6 extra stories, other than these 6 extra stories, 7 stories, other than these 7 extra stories, I would have also added The Mountains of Madness. Why not? But what about The Shadow Out of Time and The Dreams in the Witch House? I don't really like those very much. I believe they contain within themselves some of the most interesting core ideas Lovecraft ever came up with, but I don't think the final product is really that effective. Dreams in the Witch House is a bit all over the place. Shadow Out of Time feels a bit like yet another rewriting of the old Nameless City, The Mound, Mountains of Madness kind of story about old civilizations and how meaningless humanity is, already done better elsewhere. At the end of the day, guys, this video and the one I posted before are just excuses to talk about Lovecraft because I really like his fiction. Every time I reread this stuff, I find new things, and my experience of him and the meaning of his stories is evolving as I evolve as a reader and as a person, and I always enjoy talking about the stuff I'm passionate about. It's the reason why I have this channel in the first place. Let's talk Lovecraft in the comment section below if you feel like it. Thank you as always for watching the video, guys. Bye, guys.